I'd like to begin by just quickly going through the results of the election, the numbers. Okay. Can you see that, Angelica?
Yes, looks great.
Very good. Okay. So here's the outcome of the 2020 presidential election as compared to the 2024 presidential election. This was updated just about an hour ago. Right now, Trump has won 49.9% of the popular vote, and Harris has won 48.3%. So there's only about a 1.5 difference there. The difference in the popular vote is about 2.5 million votes. Interestingly, Biden won in 2020 by 7 million popular votes. Another interesting fact is that the total number of voters counted thus far, and we're pretty close to having accounted all of the ballots that were cast, is about 5 million votes less this year than last election. Trump received 2.6 million votes more this year than in 2020. And the big factor is that Kamala Harris received 7 million votes less than Joe Biden received in 2020. And again, 4.7 million fewer votes were cast in 2024 as compared to 2020. Another interesting result of the election, if you look at this bar graph, it's a little hard to read it, but visually it kind of comes through. The bars represent a percentage difference minus Republican percentage minus Democratic percentage. And you can see by the various ethnic groups, white, black, and Latino or Hispanic voters, you can see that the percentage, the plus percentage for the Republicans is similar to what it was in 24. That's the blue line going up. The plus percentage for the Democrats regarding black voters is quite similar in 2024 as it was in 2020. That's the orange line going down. But the big change is the swing, a large swing percentage-wise of Latino voters away from the Democrat liberal candidate and almost equally favoring the Republican to the Democrat vote. That's the light blue line going up. It's much less prominent Democratic vote among Latinos than it was in 2024. With that summary, I'd like to turn the program over to our moderator, Angelica Buczynski.
Thank you, Mr. Edgerly. I am thrilled to be a part of the event this evening with you all, and hello, everyone. I'm sure you're looking forward to this insightful event, as am I. And tonight we're joined by three incredible panelists: Dr. Andrew Wilson, Professor of Scriptural Studies at HJ International Graduate School, Luc Jean from Higher Purpose Forum, and James Edgerly, founder and director of the Higher Purpose Forum. As Mr. Edgerly mentioned in the beginning, we were looking forward to having Dr. David Burgess with us, the education director of the Settlement Project. However, he unfortunately has been experiencing a power outage for the past 24 hours. We apologize, and we will have to hear from him next time, and we will surely still have a wonderful event. Before we begin, I would like to introduce the format of tonight's program. Each panelist will have up to 7 to 9 minutes to share their comments, and I may give a reminder if that time is reached. Following the comments by the panelists, I will moderate a discussion among them for around 10 minutes. And panelists, as a reminder, please keep your responses and comments to the point. For the last 20 minutes, we will turn to questions and comments from the audience through the chat box, and our chat moderator for today will be John Hessel. So participants, we really encourage you to type your questions and comments into the chat at any time during the program, and we are hoping to hear from you, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. If you prefer to comment by email, please send your comments to info@higherpurposeforum.org. Also, please understand that the comments by the panelists are of their personal opinions and are not representative of any organization. So we will now hear from our panelists without further ado, and I would like to warmly welcome up Dr. Andrew Wilson to share his comments. Dr. Wilson, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My attitude towards the Trump victory in the election is complicated. I personally supported Vice President Harris, and I believed from all my indicators that God also favored her candidacy. Therefore, I was sorely disappointed. Nonetheless, my deeper concern has been the fraying of the fabric of America due to the intemperate language and vitriol, as well as changes in the social media and media atmosphere in general, that has damaged the unity of American people around political issues. And more than a man of the right or of the left, I am fully committed to Headwing, and Headwing should feature harmony, or at least efforts to promote harmony between right and left. Therefore, in keeping with my Headwing values, I want to congratulate President Trump and all of his supporters. He has my prayers and support. May he guide America well during the next 4 years. Jim Edgerly has been taking my Old Testament course, and there I spoke in one class about America's religious roots in the Old Testament, which calls for righteousness and fear of God, quoting 2 Chronicles 7:14, "If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land." I think that is the watchword of many conservative Christians when it comes to politics. So a large portion of the electorate rejoices because Trump stands for that sort of righteousness, not in his personal behavior, mind you, but a kind of Puritan and biblical values type righteousness. There is a great alarm in the country among many sectors of the populace about the overreach of the LGBTQ movement to try to invade ordinary Americans' lives, notably in transgender participation in women's sports. There is alarm over the excesses of the Black Lives Matter movement, which, with extremist calls for defunding the police, that doesn't seem to value the important work that the police is doing in maintaining order and deterring crime. Also, there is alarm over efforts of some to rewrite the American story in a way that would deny the basic goodness of the American enterprise and recast it as the work of avaricious men who trampled on minorities, blacks, Native Americans, etc. So, although people talk of Trump as a change candidate, there is a deeply conservative streak in the roots of the MAGA movement, which after all means make America great again, because it wants to reassert the basic goodness of the American story and its Puritan roots. And they see American history as blessed by God, and they want to keep going in that direction in order to keep God's blessing. There's a lot of truth in that. Those of us who supported Mrs. Harris need to understand and appreciate the values and truths of Trump supporters and not demonize them. There is a basic goodness in America, which is why God has been investing in America for all these years. Even as Democrats point out that simply trumpeting American goodness without working to remedy its flaws will not work. So I'm trying to identify myself as a Democrat who appreciates the values of the right, but at the same time see a need for balance. And if Democrats are going to do that, they need to look at themselves. They need to ask themselves some fundamental questions, like why didn't the Harris campaign speak about God? Without God, its humanistic appeals often rang hollow. They didn't touch the soul of people. And why do Democrats cave to extremist groups and embrace their excesses? Why do so many people identify progressive politics with the policies of the most extreme left? And why did President Biden wait until near the last minute before embracing a sensible immigration policy when the problem should have been addressed at the beginning of his presidency? Because everybody knew that immigration was out of control. There are these and many other questions that one could ask about the Democrats in terms of their approach to this election. People on the left cannot simply rest on their ideals and stand up with high dudgeon and criticize the other side as being somehow morally depraved just because Trump sometimes acts that way. We need to learn humility. We need to take a hard look at ourselves and our political positions. We need to stop the finger pointing that only exacerbates division and instead work constructively to build bridges. I'm always looking for people, whether Democrat or Republican, who are interested in building bridges across the aisle. Now, the reason I supported Harris is because I believe that in the age of true mother, a woman in the White House would have been a positive step towards gender balance and towards empowering Heavenly Parent, who is Heavenly Mother as well as Heavenly Father, to work in American society. I believe she would have shown compassion, a virtue that would help heal the rifts in our society. And I like her vision of a society of inclusion, which I see as aligned with God's providence. And I believe that she would have America stay the course in supporting its allies in resisting the neo-communist march of Putin, Xi Jinping, and the like. Yet I understand that in many quarters she would not be welcomed, and in such a partisan environment, letting the right have its way might be a better move for God in the long run. Heavenly Mother, that side of God, is not interested in forcing her providence on people who are unwilling to receive it. People have a portion of responsibility to welcome God's work wholeheartedly in providential matters. Therefore, it may be wise to let angry people on the right have the opportunity to let off steam, anger, and bitterness, rather than take things to the point of confrontation, states threatening to secede from the Union, and even talk of civil war. Eventually, it is hoped that through growth, through experience, and through working things out, their better angels can find a foothold. Likewise, on the left, God needs to give the smug elites on the left a spanking to promote some humility on their side as well. So I don't think that this outcome is a bad outcome for either side, looking at it from a providential point of view. There are gains and losses, and there are opportunities that we can build on. That said, I believe that the providence is moving such that America will eventually find its way to overcome the more unsavory aspects of Trump's party, including, first of all, tribalism that privileges the white tribe and its history over other groups that compose America. Headwinds should be about people listening to each other's stories, and they include Black history, Chinese American history, because my wife is Chinese, Native American history, etc. They are all part of the American story. After all, unificationists come from many ethnic backgrounds, and many of our children combine lineages from east, west, north, and south. And we should stand for one world under God. That means not throwing out textbooks or history projects that seek to promote Black history, for example, but listening to one another with love, compassion, repentance, and forgiveness for past wrongs, in order to forge a better American identity that includes everyone. I fervently believe in that. Also, I think we will find a way, I'm confident, to overcome Mr. Trump's lack of concern for global warming and the future of the environment, something that True Mother has voiced her concern about on numerous occasions. And I hope America will find a way to overcome the isolationism on the right that would abandon America's role as the elder son nation in global affairs, particularly as regards to how we treat our traditional allies, including South Korea, and nations who aspire to democratic values such as Ukraine. So many serious global issues are at stake for Trump when he comes into office. In Korea, the Middle East, Ukraine, Taiwan, South China Sea, and more. At the same time, the world has moved from a bipolar world of democratic bloc versus communist bloc, which we might call the divine principle view of the world, to a brief Pax Americana, when America was the lone superpower, and now it is becoming a multipolar world where no great power dominates and each great power wants to exert dominion over its sphere of influence. Maybe Mr. Trump, with his transactional mindset, will be well suited for the world at this transitional moment of history, for a time when America is in retreat from world leadership, and yet that Trump is able to sell to the American people as making America great again in the midst of our retreat. Yet what will that mean for the situation of the world 4 years from now? I'm praying for that. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for sharing that thought-provoking perspective. Could you unpack more on why the sense of the divine providence may cause voters to vote one way or the other, and how we might weigh the issues of the country?
Well, we do not have an America that accepted true parents. We don't have American Christianity that received true parents. Therefore, American Christianity is continuing to operate under sort of patterns of thought that come from an earlier time. And indeed, it was Father, among others, allied with Jerry Falwell and others, that created the Christian right in the 1980s as a bulwark against communism. And that Christian right has continued to flourish, finding other issues in which to make common cause against so-called progressive values, the abortion issue being one of those. On the other hand, there are many unificationists like myself who believe that the providence is moving on from where Christianity was at, and it is moving towards some kind of higher sense of global unity that can bring world peace. But how to get there when the bulk of the population doesn't yet share that vision, or if it does have that vision, it has an imperfect view of it, which doesn't really include God that much or recognize the unifying role of true parents. So in that sense, things are rather hazy and incomplete. And if the kind of global unity that the left champions, like globalization, actually leads to more problems, people are not going to accept it. And they're going to go back and fall back on what has worked in the past and the values that worked in the past, which basically were, America's an exceptional nation. We are the exceptional nation in the world, and we need to really fight to uphold the values that made us great, which are basically Christian Puritan values. So there's a movement coming from Korea where we are also supportive of Christian Puritan values, but we see it kind of extending towards a global view. It doesn't quite match up.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. We look forward to hearing more from you later tonight. And now I am delighted to welcome up Luc Jean for his comments.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Wilson, for your comments. I'd like to speak about the election system, both how it is now and how Headwing seeks to resolve some of the problems that have popped up over the past 8 to 10 years. Currently, right now, only 37% of Americans approve of President Biden. And right now, only 44% of Americans, according to the latest 538 poll, even though Trump won the election, approve of him. And 44% of Americans also approve of Kamala Harris. And if we look back all the way in 2016, even though Trump lost the popular vote, he won the Electoral College. But even during that time, both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, his opponent, both had terrible approval ratings for their time. And so the quality of candidates over the past several years has been an issue facing many American voters. The second issue of note that I want to address is the rhetoric surrounding the candidates, particularly surrounding Donald Trump, who has been called by Kamala Harris and others in the mainstream media a fascist, and some people stating, quote, he wants generals like Hitler. And this sort of rhetoric and kind of like Dr. Wilson mentioned as well, social media manipulation on both sides of the aisle have influenced voters in a very negative way. There's a vast mistrust of facts in our media and our press today. And finally, the issue of money. A report came out from the New York Times recently that explored how Kamala Harris in 15 weeks spent $1.5 billion, I'm not misspeaking, $1 billion in funding her campaign. And yet she still suffered a defeat both at the popular vote level and at the Electoral College level. And so these issues, I believe, are slowly becoming systemic. I've only been around or have been old enough to experience 3 elections, 2016, 2020, and 2024. All the other elections, I was much younger. But even during these elections, I'm noticing these issues of quality of candidates, of the rhetoric surrounding the candidates on both sides of the political spectrum, and the issue of money surrounding campaigns, super PACs, big corporation donations have are issues that I see. And these are issues that actually the founding fathers, all the way back almost 250 years ago, sought to address through the Constitution, through the election system that created. They took a lot from both Greek and Roman political philosophy. If you look at the writings of Socrates, for example, of Plato, and the exploration of Socrates' beliefs on the ideal state, Socrates states that the ideal state is not, in fact, a democracy. If you read Plato's Republic carefully, you'll find that Socrates believes the ideal state is a mix of both fascist ideas and communist ideas, where the rulers control everything, yet no one owns property. Isn't that very interesting? Yet, one thing that he believed that the Founding Fathers took was that direct democracy does not work. And the Founding Fathers agreed with that statement and tried to remedy that through creating the Electoral College, where voters indirectly voted through the use of electors. And one reason why Alexander Hamilton, for example, in Federalist 58, argued for such an election process is, quote, the process of an election affords a moral certainty that the office of president will never fail to the lot of any man, or fall to the lot of any man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications. So the Founding Fathers sought to make sure that candidates who were not qualified at all or who had extremely radical and immoral ideas would not be able to reach the stage of a presidential campaign. Also, the Founding Fathers wanted the voters to be informed voters and not have an influence of the mob or misinformation. They talked a lot about how and talked about the dangers of mob rule and how the mob can elect candidates who are woefully unqualified. But we are seeing that this system is not fully working. Candidates who most Americans disagree with highly or disapprove of tremendously are making their way to the nomination stage. Money is being blown out of proportion in these campaigns, as Kamala Harris's campaign demonstrates. So what can the headwing system offer as a possible solution to the growing systemic issues facing the United States? I'd like to start from a quote from the Exposition of the Divine Principle, which, when talking about the ideal society introduction, its introduction says, people would no longer wish to do anything that would cause pain to their neighbor because God will be within everyone's heart. Such a radical utopian claim, for sure. But if we look at the new essentials of unification thought, if we go all the way to the back in the appendix, in page 525, I believe, I want to just read a paragraph from it stating what it believes the ideal election system would look like. It says the candidates would run for election not by their own will, but rather with the recommendation of many neighbors, brothers and sisters, namely by the will of others, since those who are in the relationship of brothers and sisters centered on true love will make mutual recommendations. Third, an election will not take place in a way that would require an enormous expenditure of money, with all the accompanying side effects, such as super PACs and big corporate donations, like I mentioned earlier. It goes on to say, after a preliminary election in the first stage, an election by lottery would be made in the second stage, accompanied by solemn prayer and appropriate formality. With the assurance and confidence that the election outcome was in accord with God's will, those elected, those not elected, and in fact all the people would be thankful to God and could accept the results happily and sincerely. Take a second to digest that. It's definitely, on first glance, very utopian. When I first read it back in high school, yes, I was that nerdy high schooler, I was shocked. I could not believe, what are we doing? A lottery system? But let's go through it bit by bit. First, unification thought asserts that the quality of candidates will be guaranteed through a nomination of peers, and people are mutually nominated by others, not through a political party, which we have today. If we look at how candidates from each political party, Democrat and Republican respectively, are chosen, it's through a primary process which is filled with party politics, party policies, and in fact, super PACs. For example, in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the nomination over progressive Bernie Sanders because Hillary Clinton got what's called super delegates, where those are delegates that are not fully influenced by the voters. And the same thing happened in 2020. And since then, former presidential candidate Bernie Sanders has been outspoken against those systemic issues in the Democrat Party, for example. Similarly, in the Republican Party in the 2024 election, President-elect Donald Trump was able to abstain from all primary debates and had such a large support from his own party, whereby the rest of the candidates that were seeking to become the Republican nominee didn't seem to have as much of a voice, and the debates didn't seem to matter at all. But through the mutual recommendation of peers, we can start at the local level, for example, when multiple people are recommending the same person. That guarantees not only quality, but also the say of the voters. So take, for example, a city. Let's say someone in a neighborhood is being recommended, and they're such a good neighbor that everyone on the street and perhaps everyone on the block is recommending this person as someone to be a candidate in the preliminary election, the primary, quote unquote. That would require a lot of civic responsibility. However, if people took their civic responsibility seriously, the voters would have full say rather than a mix between voters and party policies and politics. Furthermore, this would also substantially remove money from the process, money funding the party, for example. Also, money in order to get the candidate known. If we take this at a local level or even a state level, if multiple people and eventually maybe tens of thousands are recommending them, there'll be a lot less need, for example, for political advertisements. Now,
If you may kindly wrap up your thoughts in a few
Yes,
seconds.
thank you.
Thank you.
So now we go to the Unification Thoughts lottery system, which is intended to prevent negative voter manipulation through God being in everyone's heart. Now, that I believe will take a lot more time. Of course, in the ideal kingdom of heaven, or whatever you'd like to call it, if God's in everyone's heart, then naturally people will accept the results. Naturally, people will trust it's God's will. But God is not in everyone's heart. He is not fully in the society. He is not fully in the election system. So I believe that system, while maybe possible, is definitely not possible in the near future. But I believe that a recommendation system encouraging civic responsibility rather than recommendations through political party may be something that could be used to improve this and solve the systemic issues we're facing in our election system now. So those are some of my thoughts I've been thinking about, and I appreciate you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luc, for sharing that fascinating perspective with us. Now it is my pleasure to welcome up James Edgerly, founder and director of the Higher Purpose Forum, to share his comments with us.
Well, Luc, that was pretty provocative. We'll have to get back at you during our discussion. Thank you for a chance to speak. I'll try to go through this pretty quickly. I have a real hard time thinking that Americans place their votes as it so often seems to be presented out of their own narrow self-interests, their own pocketbook. I just have never seen that that you vote for the American presidency with that as your motivation. And so my hypothesis is quite different than that. I don't have data for this, but I believe that people vote for president based upon primarily out of their concern for the future of the country, not merely out of the narrow self-interest. I'm sure both factors are considered. But I believe people vote for president based upon their concern for the future of our country. And one statistic that came up repeatedly before the election, which really struck me, was that 70% of the people who said they were going to vote believed or stated that the country was headed in the wrong direction. That's a huge loss of confidence in the electorate about the direction that our country is presently going in. And therefore, I believe that this election is fundamentally people voted out of a desire to see a change in the direction of the country. They voted for the candidate that they thought would change the country in the direction they felt it needs to go. So the question then becomes, what exactly is wrong specifically with the direction of our country? And I have spent a lot of time on this question, on behalf of Higher Purpose Forum. And I've came up with basically 5 underlying factors that I think are the core, I would say almost mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive dynamics, the underlying dynamics in our country that are creating such change that our country is having such a hard time coping with. And I believe that people who say that this country is going in the wrong direction are struggling with 1 or 2 or 3 of these underlying dynamics. And I just want to quickly go through what those 3 things are. You might not agree with me, but I will say I've done a lot of research trying to answer this question. What are the core dynamics going on in our country right now? And I'm going to quickly go through 3 of them. The first one I think is by far the most important, and that is that, as Dr. Wilson mentioned, our country has been built around a cultural consensus that came out of our Protestant mainline inheritance. It's been with us since the Pilgrims came over on the Puritans came over on the Mayflower, and all the settlements of most of the colonies. The most influential of which, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, had a huge multi-generational impact on the culture of our country, and those are our cultural roots. You know, in the past 40 years, the position of mainline Protestantism has gone from being the dominant source of cultural consensus to being completely irrelevant. Now, no more than 10% of American people attend Protestant churches on a regular basis. And even those who do attend are elderly. There's no intergenerational transfer of that Protestant culture. That is not going to get turned around. So because of the decline of mainline Protestantism, we have completely lost the basis for our cultural consensus. And the result of that is a very serious culture war, which we're all very aware of. We're not having a civil war, but we definitely are having a cultural war because of the loss of cultural consensus. The second of the three dynamics, I would say, is that in our country, something has happened in our economy that's never happened in any other economy before. We have a massive concentration of wealth, an imbalance in the concentration of wealth in our country. Here's a statistic that's kind of amazing. The top 1% of wealth holders in this country have 10 times the wealth of the bottom 50%. The top 1% of our country have $43 trillion of wealth, and the bottom 50% of our country have $4 trillion of wealth. So there's this grossly undemocratic character in our economic system, and that leads to very serious undemocratic political processes. And so there's a sense in our country, there's a sense in the country that the economy and therefore the political system is rigged. And a lot of people feel like they're economic outsiders and they're political outsiders. And that's because we have is remarkable disparity in wealth, in the wealth distribution, more than any other country has ever seen before. The third issue is and this is something also that Dr. Wilson referred to, as I believe this is a big issue. It has to do with tribalism that he referred to. That there's definitely a loss of hegemony is occurring by the dominant European tribe that has had tribal hegemony in our country for 400 years. And that is over. The European tribe is no longer the dominant tribe in this country in many areas. I mean, in some areas it may still be, but its hegemony is definitely on the decline. And that's been going on basically ever since the success of the civil rights legislation in the 1960s. And it's had a profound interest on where people feel they stand in the political system. And a lot of people who felt that they were once in the mainstream culture of our country are now starting to feel like outsiders. And this is a big issue that affects the way people see the political process. I'm talking about my tribe, the European American tribe. For many, many generations, the dominant cultural tribe in this country is no longer has hegemony over the direction the country is taking. So I don't know of any other country in history where the dominant tribe has peacefully relinquished control. Can you imagine that happening in Korea? That the Korean Han tribe would actually allow itself to be replaced by Latinos or even by Chinese. And you can go through any country, the Germans, the Italians, that's never going to happen in those countries, but it's happening here. Okay, so basically we have these three underlying issues. A loss of the basis for our cultural norms because of the decline of Protestantism. And Dr. Wilson mentioned the key area where this comes up is particularly in sexual norms and family norms. The second thing is that this sense by many people that even though the economy is growing, I'm going nowhere. A lot of people are getting wealthy, but my real wages, and that's a fact, real wages for most Americans have been flat since 1970. And thirdly, the sense of loss of power by many people. They feel like they're outsiders in their own country. So in the context of these challenges, voters have had to make the decision about who they want to help them deal with these big challenges in our country. And they had a choice between an unambiguously conservative candidate and an unambiguously progressive candidate. There's a real, unlike many elections in the past, there's a real choice here. And unlike what happened in 2020, the voters chose the conservative candidate as the person who they believe would move the country in the right direction. To me, that's basically what happened. Now, why they chose the conservative candidate to deal with these fundamental issues is a really good question. We thought that David Burgess would answer that question for us, but unfortunately he couldn't be here tonight. But those are the comments that I'd like to offer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Edgerly, for your intriguing comments. Now we will bring up all of our panelists, and I would like to remind the audience that if you have any questions or comments for the panel, please type them into the chat box, and we will be getting to them shortly. During this discussion, also, if any of the panelists have questions for each other, please don't hesitate to ask one another or to share further comments on any of the perspectives given. And so first, I would like to ask Jean-Luc, realistically, how could one possibly establish a so-called parental role within the election process?
Thanks for the question. My first name is Luc, by the way. Jean-Luc Picard, I know. So if there's any Trekkies out there. No. Well, I mean, in the unificationist faith, the easiest way to do that is to have everyone know about true parents. It says it in the Divine Principle, says it in Unification Thought over and over again. How that practically happens, well, the unification movement has been trying to figure that out for over 50 years. I believe, Dr. Wilson, you mentioned how America did not accept Father when he was here. But I think in this election, I think both Dr. Wilson and Mr. Edgerly both mentioned how, on the conservative side at least, there's a desire to return to a Protestant, or more broadly, God-centered way of life, and how the Kamala Harris campaign, or Kamala Harris, didn't really talk about God. And for our faith, that means there was no talk of the parental figure. And for the conservative side, it seemed that the parental figure, God, was trying to be brought back into the culture. So how that practically works, I think we're still trying to figure it out. But I think this election was kind of a statement of at least trying to bring back God into the mainstream of culture. Yes.
Great points. Dr. Wilson or Mr. Edgerly, would you like to add anything to that?
Problem is, what kind of God? The God of the conservatives is the traditional patriarchal Judeo-Christian God. But where the providence is at now with the Heavenly Parent, who is Heavenly Mother as well as Heavenly Father, is a different understanding of God. And yet that understanding of God has not yet penetrated the minds and hearts of most Americans. Now, there is a lot of disaffection with religion, as James pointed out. The largest group of the largest growth in religion has been in the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, those people who have no religion. And a lot of them are attracted to New Age spirituality, yoga, astrology, all sorts of things. But they're very scattered, and they can be very self-absorbed, and many of them don't have a really strong sense of how to unite together in the way Protestant Christianity has in terms of a vision for the nation. And True Mother hasn't yet fully articulated, in my view, for unificationism, what does it mean for the kingdom of heaven that our God is Heavenly Parent and not just Heavenly Father. Some people are understanding that internally through realizations that they are getting. Others are not. I think Latinos in particular have a relatively macho culture, so they are very much attracted to that sort of patriarchy. But I don't think the kingdom of heaven of Chanilguk is going to be a patriarchy. I think it's going to be a radically different society, because our spirituality will have changed. But American spirituality has not changed yet. And so to me, it is a process. And to me, the best guarantee of good candidates is that people change their hearts. And when people change their hearts, they'll vote for people who are more like them, more suitable to where they want leaders to be. But I want to just make clear, I think Mr. Trump is extremely qualified to be president. He's not in the intellectual type of elitist qualifications, but as terms of being a master at reading public opinion and being a master at understanding people and where the people are, what the people are thinking and what they want, he is exceptional. I think as the last president who had that kind of grasp of the public was Bill Clinton. So I think I want to give Mr. Trump every chance to prove himself to be an effective and transformational president in a good way. We'll see.
I'd like to give an example of kind of what you're talking about how the conservative viewpoint of the patriarchal God does not work and will not win over the new atheists especially. I actually just this afternoon was listening to a debate between a very young atheist / skeptic, Alex O'Connor. He has like 1 million subscriber following on YouTube, and the conservative Dinesh D'Souza. He's a American Indian Christian. And from the moment Mr. D'Souza got up and spoke, it was over. His arguments were very weak. He disparaged Alex O'Connor because of his British accent and claimed that, oh, you new atheists always have British accents, and he had no defense for the brutality of the Old Testament God. And he clearly viewed God in a solely patriarchal manner, and it just wasn't working. The arguments were weak. They weren't landing. You got a sense from the audience that they weren't landing. And so I definitely agree that the viewpoint of God as a heavenly parent is the long-term key for this issue, because otherwise the conservative and the patriarchal version of God, it will never be able to fully defeat the new atheists, people like Richard Dawkins, for example. It just can't.
Thank you. Well said, Luc Jean.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Mr. Edgerly. Do you think that your core dynamics are changes for the better, or perhaps they could be changes for the worse? Oh, you're muted, Mr. Edgerly.
The first issue of the decline of Christianity, I believe, is a providential development, and what's missing is the Great Awakening that hasn't happened. And the Great Awakening, I think, that is needed, is desperately needed, is what Dr. Wilson's been referring to as a much more broad, international, pluralistic version of Christianity, not going back to the kind of Christianity that I grew up in as a New England Congregationalist. As Luke said, that doesn't win people over. So there needs to be a new impression. So I think the decline of Protestant Christianity is just part of providential development. The second issue of economic, the distribution of the maldistribution of wealth in our country is not a good thing. I have no idea why none of the presidential candidates brought it up even once. It's not an issue for discussion, and it should be. It's a huge issue in our country, and it's not good. The third issue of the decline of the European, the hegemony of the European American tribe. Again, I believe that is providentially destined to happen. We have to create a global family, a microcosm in this country to become the elder son nation. And the people in my tribe have to learn to live as one of many tribes and accept the great contributions that all the other tribes can make. So that change is irreversible and inevitable, and it's a good thing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
I will say quickly, I think one of the big reasons that Kamala Harris lost was because she embraced she did not embrace the family model whatsoever. if Donald Trump was far more moderate, despite what some members of the media were saying on the issues of family. He's never come out against gay marriage, at least in this election cycle. He never supported a national abortion ban, for example. He kept saying, leave it to the states, leave it to the states. Because he knew if he was going to attract moderate voters, he could not say a more staunch, harsher stance against abortion, like his vice presidential candidate was saying before he became the vice president-elect. So I think that was a very big flaw in Kamala Harris's campaign. She did not embrace the family model, and she went fully the opposite way. And a majority of Americans, whether they believe in God or not, they do want the traditional family.
Yes.
I'd like to shift gears a little and at this time bring up John Hessel, our chat moderator, to point out or highlight any questions and comments from the participants in the chat box.
Angelica, I'm not seen on the screen because my camera's not working, but there were a number of comments and questions. I'm going to start with some of the later ones because they're more pertinent to where the conversation's gone right now. One by Mark Anderson. Question for all the panelists. The UC movement used to be very relevant in the 1980s with CAUSA, the Washington Times, and a network of activists in every state led by the American Freedom Coalition. Unfortunately, we have now become totally irrelevant and have no voice at all in America today. What do you see as a way to become relevant again, or should we just stay home and pray?
Well, that's really outside.
To anyone.
That's really outside of the scope of discussing the election results.
It's a wonderful question, Mark. And I have been struggling with that myself. I think the church, or members of the church, not depending on Korea, but our own American church, we have to figure out what we stand for. It was easy in the days when we were fighting communism. There was an enemy that we could fight because communism was Satan's tool. But now that whole era is over. So what do we stand for building Chanilguk? I would like to see the church come up with a simple set of bullet points, principles of what Chanilguk should look like. Yes, supporting family values is definitely going to be on that list. But I think that we need to do that kind of intellectual work as a movement. And if we have that clear in our minds, we would be able to take positions and we'd be able to engage in action and we'd be able to find allies and be relevant again. We have stopped being relevant because our movement was basically about attending a messianic leader. But how do you operate as a movement once that messianic leader is gone? I'm speaking of Father now. It took Christianity about 20 years between death of Jesus and the time of St. Paul to get its messaging gear. So do not despair. We'll get there, but it takes a little bit of time and a little bit of historical distance from the messianic event in order for us to really own it ourselves. And because still we are asking questions like, what does Mother think? Or what does the church think? Or what do the church elders think? But, if peace starts with me, then I need to understand what I think. And I think we're still working on that.
I'd if it's okay, I'd like to weigh in on the question. I agree with Dr. Wilson. It's a great question.
This meeting is about the outcome of the election.
I understand. Okay. And I think the outcome of the election has to, we're the microcosm. So the unresolved issues, the divisions in our movement reflect the divisions that are playing themselves out in the church. Mm-hmm. So in the same way that the point that Dr. Wilson is making, we're looking for what the great one thinks. I think Trump represents that role for a lot of Americans. He's going to save us, but it's just that thinking is just as flawed as it was with Father. We have to create something substantial ourselves. And in our movement, in some ways, we were not supporting the messianic vision because Father, when he went from being in the role of John the Baptist, because Father stated in the divine principle that Jesus was crucified in the position of John the Baptist, and that essentially Christianity failed. So Father went through 3 stages of speaking to the world, Madison Square Garden, Yankee Stadium, and Washington Monument, to go from being in the position of John the Baptist, testifying about a Messiah, to being the Messiah. And after Washington Monument, everybody wanted to know, is it a victory? Where does it stand?
John, this conversation is about the 2024 presidential election.
I understand,
Not about what
but
happened in 1976 in Madison Square Garden.
Well, I guess let me just say this. But
Thank you, Mr. Lowe, and I'd like to bring us back on topic here and turn it back to Mr. Hessel to highlight any other comments or questions from the audience.
Okay, another interesting comment from Chris Kennedy. I'll read it. It's a bit long. Well, there are a few things regarding the current Gestalt without the ability to assert a hierarchy of values that stands above all others. There's no sense of unified culture. The modern left wing is inherently unable to do this, as it has been fully overtaken by postmodern thought and social ideologies downstream of postmodern thought. A current coherent culture is characterized by not only what it allows, but what it forbids. The left wing is almost completely helpless to assert true values and is forever caught in an attempt to fully deconstruct identity and then use intersectionality to create inherent coalitions that pit different people against one another for tactical demographic gains. To escape a state of cultural weakness, the choice must be made to assert one set of values over another.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting comment. I think that, first of all, one of the basic premises of both unification, especially actually one of the core premises of unification thought, is that there is nothing that democracy by itself cannot fully defeat postmodern thought and Marxist thought. And I think that this even kind of infiltrates our own movement. We forget that that means that even Donald Trump, who cannot, and his political beliefs and the conservative ideology cannot fully defeat the postmodern arguments. I think many people are trying. Dr. Jordan Peterson is one modern intellectual that comes to mind. He spends hours and hours trying to tackle the postmodern problems. But in unificationism, we believe that headwing thought, unification thought, divine principle is the solution to postmodernism and Marxism and can create that hierarchy of values. One of the big staples of postmodernism, or at least what results from postmodernism, is that there is no objective standard to determine your values. Now, conservatives say, wait, we do have a hierarchy of values. We do. Look at us. Look at biology. Look at psychology. Look at this. Look at that. But it has to come from to give a unification thought concept something that's absolute, unique, unchanging, and eternal. And unfortunately, many of the examples that the conservatives use do not fit that criteria. So I guess it kind of goes back to we need to be the third awakening, as Mr. Edgerly talked about. Because otherwise, if we believe that democratic thought and the conservative ideology that we have today, if we believe it can't defeat postmodern Marxism, then I'm not sure what can.
A comment from earlier in our conversation from Stephen Stacy. Many social commentators note that progressivism which the Democrats support, has its roots in Marxist thought, hence the term cultural Marxism. Reverend Moon fought tirelessly against economic Marxism. Why should unificationists support cultural Marxism?
Why should unificationists support cultural Marxism?
Yes.
What is cultural Marxism?
Well, cultural Marxism sort of comes out of Gramsci and this idea that the culture controls consciousness, not the not economics. The consciousness, political consciousness, is controlled by the culture, not it is not production relations that controls consciousness. So you have to change the culture.
Well, then it's not Marxism.
Well, it's Western
That's
Marxism.
not Marxism.
What does that have to do with the 2024 election?
Not much.
Not much.
Well, I will say that one of the terms that has been, one of the pieces of rhetoric that was thrown around by the conservative side of the aisle was that Democrats are all communists. Now, I'll say for myself, I do not believe that is an accurate statement. I think that is a terrible piece of rhetoric to use. However, one of the core pieces of Marxism is class struggle. Now, when it says cultural Marxism, I'm not sure that cultural is necessarily the right term, but when we look at how races are being pit against each other, of how people of different sexual identities are being pitted against each other, it mirrors, at least in my opinion, it mirrors quite substantially to Karl Marx's description of class struggle. And what we saw, for example, Dr. Wilson, you mentioned the remnants of the BLM movement. Black Lives Matter was a social movement to inspire social change, to end the remnants of racism that are still very real in this country. But because the founders were explicitly trained Marxists, that's what they said on their website. I think they've taken it down by now. They got a lot of blowback from it. But that led to violent riots. And I think and even though that rhetoric was probably not the best, it was effective because voters saw, oh, well, look, Black Lives Matter looted cities in Minnesota and Portland, Oregon. Oh, look, that races are being pit against each other. Why is the white tribe being criticized so much? I think voters saw that, and I guess that's where I'll leave it. Yeah, there is some roots of Marxism, at least in my opinion, and I think especially moderates kind of reacted to that, as well as the more conservatives.
Well, I think headwing has to be about rejecting violence, rejecting pitting one class against another, and finding ways to work our problems together by respecting each other's point of view. And I have to say, my reading of the Black Lives Matter movement was that there was a lot of good stories of police departments having good dialogue with African American leaders and police departments changing some of their tactics, and renegade policemen who were extremely racist getting booted out. And so in spite of the riots, and there have been riots in just about every social movement, including the civil rights days with Black Power movement and so on, and it actually takes a lot of self-discipline to keep a movement from turning into rioting at some point or another. But I think the Black Lives Matter movement has had a lot of success, and it's the quiet success. It's not the success that is trumpeted in the media. It's the success that comes from people in communities all over the country sitting down with Black community leaders and police and working on improving community relations, because police will also know that they'll be more effective at policing if they have good community relations. So I do not buy the right-wing story about Black Lives Matter. I do not think that's really fair to the great majority of people who support that movement.
Yeah, I definitely think that riots and outbreaks of violence are very difficult to avoid. If you take a U.S. history course in high school, there are tons of types of riots, both by the conservatives of the time and the progressives of the time. I guess for me, I've had an opportunity to read some of the postmodernist thinkers, especially in the realm of critical race theory, such as Bettina L. Love and others. And what I found is that there is a very much unhidden attempt to pit races against each other in the spirit of trying to rectify the past. And I think that the idea of sharing stories and really practicing listening in order to encourage healing is definitely happening as well. And I think that's a very good thing, and that's something that Headwing definitely supports. But I also believe that writings from authors such as Bettina L. Love and others who kind of explain in detail what this actually looks like, what this, cultural, if we want to use that word, Marxism looks like, it's very anti-Headwing, in my opinion, because it wants to promote conflict through more class division, race division, and division of all kinds. I think the beauty of what Mother Moon has been saying is stop the division and unite centered on the heavenly parent, which is both a father and a mother.
Thank you. Mr. Hessel, it would be great if we could squeeze in one more question before the end of the evening. I know there's a lot of great ones in there.
There are. Laura Holmbrook said, trying to put secular government into the role of morality policing will never succeed. Politics is downstream from culture, and culture is downstream from religion and ideology. We have to start with religion, ideology, not politics.
Well, there still needs to be a government, and it is true that values and morality does come up in presidential elections. So the base of our society is religion and culture, and the external expression, I believe, is politics, and the two do get intermingled. And they certainly did in this election. There's a lot that came out in the area of values, but as Luc said, the one party completely vacated taking any kind of advocacy towards family values, and the other one really didn't.
Yeah, and I think the unification movement has kind of grappled with this challenge, especially soon after Father Moon died. If you look at the first version of the Chunoguk Constitution that was created, I mean, it was, at least in my opinion, very susceptible to corruption and the negative aspects of theocracy. Very susceptible. And in fact, they did a second version, and then Mother Moon eventually said, okay, scrap both of these. We got to take time and find a better one, because there was a lot of outcry, especially from the far right aspects of our movement. So I think it's definitely, how do we separate religion and values and politics, and how do we deal with the intermingledness of that? That's a challenge, even in our movement, we haven't fully resolved. And that's, the question I think, Dr. Wilson, you brought up, which is, what does Chunoguk actually look like? What are the core sets of values? What does the governing structure look like? I mean, in divine principle and unification thought, it's very utopian from one sense. We have this set of true parents, and God is in everyone's hearts. And so, of course, everything will be fine, because we all have the absolute sense of goodness and morality in our hearts. But peace starts with me. And me, I don't have that. I get scared of God in my heart oftentimes. And so I kind of back away. And I think that's a lot of people, including a lot of, people such as the New Atheists. I mean, even Richard Dawkins, for him, even questions about, the causal world is just not interesting to him. And so we got a long way to go. But conversations like these, I feel, kind of at least start us in the right direction.
Let's all put God in our hearts more by staying active in our local politics, in being involved. If we believe peace starts with me, then let's be one of those people that is a peacemaker. Let's not sit back in our homes and just theorize. Let's get out in the communities, work with local issues, and see if we can apply our values as unificationists to the problems that we face as communities. I think that the divine principle model is that the kingdom of heaven begins from the home, begins from the family, and then expands to the communities, the society, the nation, and the world. So rather than think that we're going to create utopia on earth by a presidential election, we need to work on our local level, start from the small and build up from there.
Well, that is a really great note to end on. Thank you so much.
Can I squeeze in one more question, which Spasse had his hand up and he didn't get to ask? Would you mind one more? Since you asked him to write. There's maybe not a quick answer, but he asked, where do you, the panel, stand on the immigration policy in regards to the deportation of illegal or undocumented immigrants? Maybe that's too long to answer.
I don't think the panel has a position on that, but
I mean, I can say something. To me, this issue is a classic example of relative good versus relative evil, which we see in Exposition of the Divine Principle when it talks about the providence of restoration. Because no matter what solution you do, it's not gonna be ideal, because it's a really serious problem. How do you treat everyone in the most humane way while also, maintaining national security, which, if it fails, can harm a bunch of other people that live in the country? So what is my personal opinion on it? I think you have to, the relative good would be that I feel Heavenly Parent would support would be the violent criminals and people that are associated with the drug cartels. You got to start with them first and go from there. But doing just that will take a while. So all I can say is start there, because I think most people can agree that you got to get the criminals and people associated with drug cartels out. And honestly, I think that's another reason why Kamala Harris lost, because her and the Biden administration for too long refused to do anything. Especially that interview where Kamala Harris said she went to the border and Lester Holt was like, okay, but you've never been. And she's like, oh, we've been to the border. We've been to the border. Meanwhile, like, people in El Paso, Texas, and all the border states are like, why isn't anyone dealing with this issue? Like, there's tons of fentanyl and other drugs entering our communities. So Heavenly Parent's heart would be, keep people safe from the violence and the drugs, and then go from there.
Well said. Thank you, Luc.
Thank you.
well said. Yes.
We want to thank you all so much for all of your questions and comments, and apologize that we were not able to get to all of them. If you would like to send any of your comments to Higher Purpose Forum, you may do so by emailing info@higherpurposeforum.org. And I want to truly thank our wonderful panelists for taking the time to share their insights with us on this very important topic. It was deeply thought-provoking. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight. A recording of this program will be posted on the Higher Purpose Forum YouTube channel if you would like to listen to it again or share it with your friends and family. It was an honor to be with you all, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you, and
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Beautiful forum. Thank you for your honesty, Dr. Wilson. And thank you for your good points, Jim. And Luc, you're dynamo. I love it.
Thank you so much.
Master Luc. We call him Master
James
Luc.
Edgerly.